Welcome back to Through a Glass Darkly Radio. You're the intro music on you. You're listening to United Public Radio. The intro music was "Mark of the Doomslayer" by Carl Casey at White Bat Audio. And today, I'm very happy to say that we have a perennial favorite, Dr. John Brandenburg. Dr. Brandenburg is a plasma physicist. He did his graduate work in California at Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory in controlled plasmas for fusion power and has worked in defense, energy, and space research. Dr. Brandenburg was also part of the Clementine mission to the moon, which discovered water at the moon's poles. However, the focus of Brandenburg's scientific career has been to complete the great effort of Einstein to unify the two long-range forces of nature, gravity and electromagnetism. Dr. Brandenburg, welcome back, my friend.
Always a pleasure and honor to be on your show, Sean.
All right, so Cosmic Awakening, that's the title of this episode. But
wake up.
Yeah, people don't know what to expect. Like, why is it called Cosmic Awakening?
Well, it's actually it's taken from a concept from the book Dune.
And to be clear, you have a book out called Cosmic Awakening, so that's
it's Cosmic Awakening. The full title is Cosmic Awakening: What Really Happened at Roswell and the Genesis of the UFO Cover-Up. So it's basically a secret history of the kind of conditions of the beginning of the UFO cover-up. Why do we have a UFO cover-up? Why has it lasted so long? What is it they don't want to tell us?
And this is nonfiction. This is not like one of
this
your
is not
fiction.
Well, when I write something under my real name, John Brandenburg, that's nonfiction. When I write, when Victor Norgard writes, my alternate personality that comes out on a full moon, that's fiction. But of course, I write science fiction that tries to be based as much on plausible reality as possible. So you'll find a lot of overlap between my science fiction and things I'm publishing now.
And so, what inspired you to write this, and why now? Why is it coming out now?
Well, part of it was I'd been doing research on what had happened at Roswell and getting all the data I could on it. And I was actually privileged to go to a reunion of all the veterans of Roswell, including the daughters of the sheriff of Roswell, New Mexico, at the time of the incident in 1947. And, a lot of the officers who were retired, but they came to this conference in Washington, D.C., and they explained what they went through and what it was like. And then I've tried to do as much research to get every possible piece of information, and what you have to do is you have to basically assign a credibility number to, various reports. And basically you're looking for commonalities of messages from various reports. Do they make sense as a whole? And some of them do, some of them don't. But anyway, so I basically reached kind of critical mass, if you like, as far as understanding what really happened at Roswell and why this was basically the genesis of the UFO cover-up, which continues to this day. It set the pattern for it. And so there's a reason everyone talks about Roswell so much, is because it was very, very important. It was a hinge of history, as they say, a watershed event.
Now, you already have a very tantalizing question from Rusty Gruner. So, John,
yes,
are we going to have catastrophic disclosure?
I hope not. The public needs to be brought up to speed. And I'm hoping my book will help bring people up to speed. So this will not be a big shock. I'll discuss an incident of, we've already had a little bit of catastrophic disclosure right in the White House under Jimmy Carter's administration. I'll get to that in a minute. But the truth needs to come out. I can summarize it very quickly. 3 sentences. We're not alone in the universe. We're not the most advanced people in the universe. And the universe, rest of the universe, has intelligent beings in it, technological intelligent beings. And some of them are very nice and are very similar to us. They're kind of our kindred genetically. And some of them are extremely unpleasant. And we've had to deal with them. So I'm sorry. The universe is just like the Earth. The universe has good and evil in it, and it's a complex place. But we're not alone, and we're going to have to adjust to that. Yeah, there's a comment. I can discuss the unified field theory later. Let's talk just about Roswell and the UFO cover-up right now.
Mm-hmm.
Then I will talk about and I in the book, by the way, I talk about the unified field theory and its role in all of this. The Germans were working intensively on this during World War II, and the United States was able to inherit their research. I discussed that in the book. So basically, World War II had World War II from about 1942. Well, actually, if you go back to about 1900, a strange thing happened. The first kind of modern UFO sighting happened. It was called the Big Airship. And here's the thing. The human race is sort of psychic, especially in science fiction. It actually imagines things before they happen.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that happened was, we had Jules Verne, the Flight to the Moon. That, of course, happened later. But before, he also wrote a book called Rober the Conqueror about a big airship. It was like a kind of helicopter with all these different rotors on it, flying around the world, doing shock and awe. And they turned it into a movie called Master of the Earth. In fact, there were basically two novels based on that. So he wrote that novel, and then about 10 years afterwards, there was a real airship sighting. This thing would fly over like San Francisco and Sacramento, California, various places, and it had big, powerful lights on it. And I discussed that in the book. So it was basically a UFO in those days. But it had been foretold in this book by Jules Verne, curiously enough. And then they built the Suez Canal, which impressed everybody. So everybody was really big into canals in those days. The Suez Canal was, for the British, was just great because they could get to India in a week, as opposed to sailing around Africa, which took them 2 months to get to between England and India. So they could get their tea real fresh now. So people were really into canals, and Lowell had just come back from visiting Japan and seeing the culture there, a very interesting alien culture that was coming into the modern world. And its symbol, of course, was a big red dot on a flag. And he put up the best telescope on Earth. He became obsessed with the idea of Mars canals that people had spotted. And so he set up the best sighted observatory on Earth with one of the best telescopes on Earth. And he was starting to look at canals. So he said, gee, I see signs of civilization on the planet Mars. And everybody knew Mars had polar caps, it had dust storms, it had an atmosphere. It wasn't like the moon. It was like another planet Earth. And so he had published that. There had been this airship sighting. And then H.G. Wells comes out with the book War of the Worlds. And War of the Worlds, you must imagine, to Victorian England was absolutely stunning and shocking. They, in War of the Worlds, London is leveled. It is leveled. It's like Dresden after the firebombing. And the Martians, and they have heat ray and poison gas, and they just massacre everybody. And by the way, another aspect of that they don't talk about, they drink blood. They drink human blood for sustenance. So this is really a horrifying novel. He actually had British artillery take down one Mars. They hit it. They scored a direct hit on the top of the tripod with an artillery shell and knocked it down. The Martians responded then with poison gas. And then he had a ship, knocked down two of them, one with gunfire and one where they rammed it. So, but the fact is the human race just kind of collapsed in front of the Martian invasion. But of course, then the Martians, because they had no immunity to things like athlete's foot or, to the common cold, they're drinking Earth's blood. So they're getting all these diseases. So they die. Their invasion failed disastrously, but not before killing millions and millions of people and leveling London. I mean, and to the British, this was just completely stunning. No one had ever damaged London. Even the Spanish Armada had not gotten even close to England.
Mm-hmm.
And so that came out in about 1900, and it really stuck in people's imagination. Everybody read it. Even before the internet, people read stuff. And printing presses were very advanced, so everybody read this book. Everybody who was smart. And they knew about Lowell finding what looked like civilization on Mars. And they also knew from a Russian named Tsiolkovsky, that you could build rockets to go in between planets. Tsiolkovsky had worked it all out. And Goddard, then in the United States, actually built a liquid-fueled rocket and launched it, and it worked. So everybody was it all looked very plausible, an invasion from outer space. And if you're England in those days, you are the superpower on Earth. No power on Earth can challenge you. But suppose there's somebody not from Earth who challenges you. So anyway, so that was the part of the mental landscape, was this horrendous invasion from outer space with massive loss of life, and literally bloodthirsty aliens. So then we go on, and to give you another example of something that was going on, somebody wrote this book called Futility. It was about a big ocean liner called the Titan sailing across the Atlantic, full of rich people, that runs into an iceberg and sinks. That was written in about 1886. And then 14 years later, the Titanic actually runs into an iceberg and sinks with massive loss of life. It was an example of, along with Jules Verne, of science fiction being prophetic. And people knew that. And some of the people, especially in the government, started wondering, I wonder if we're going to have an invasion from outer space. I mean, the common people didn't worry about that stuff, at least not consciously. So then we had World War I, we had World War II. Oh, and they discovered nuclear power. A woman named Lise Meitner, she was Jewish. She had to flee Germany when Hitler came to power. She ended up in Sweden, and she figured out you could build an atomic bomb. She was a hotshot physicist, and they wanted to give her the Nobel Prize, but the Swedes who ran the Nobel Prize committee were afraid the Germans were going to win World War II at that point, so they wouldn't give it to her because they didn't want to offend the Germans. The Germans had territory all around them: Finland, Norway, Denmark, and all was all controlled by the Germans. So, but anyway, she figured out how to build an atomic bomb, and a guy named Robert Oppenheimer read her article and figured out in an afternoon, yes, you could build an atomic bomb. Not only that, he was an expert in old Hindu Sanskrit, and there's a depiction of what sounds like a nuclear weapon, tactical nuclear weapon, being used on a Bronze Age army, complete with war elephants. So
that's like the Vimanas, right?
Yeah, it's in the Bhagavad Gita, and so Oppenheimer believes this stuff. So he knows an atomic bomb is possible, and he thinks somebody may have already used one once. So he knows in his heart it's possible to do this. So in the meantime, the Germans almost go to war over this place called the Sudetenland. Now, they claimed it was because the border was drawn wrong, and these were mostly Germans. They were living in Czechoslovakia. As it turns out, the Sudetenland was the only place in Europe where you found uranium to make bombs with.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yes,
Yeah.
hardly anybody knows that. I figured it. I did a lot of research on this. That was one of the hidden reasons that Hitler wanted the Sudetenland, because everyone was talking in Germany where they had discovered atomic power, basically in the lab. I mean, so we're rolling along, and Marconi is sending out his first radio broadcast in 1900. Everything happened around 1900 to set the stage. So then, of course, finally, Oppenheimer. What happened was Einstein and Edward Teller and a guy named Szilard. They figured out from the same thing that Oppenheimer figured out, that you could build an atomic bomb because Lise Meitner published this scientific article. Everybody read it. And Teller and Szilard went to Einstein, who invented E equals mc squared, and said, look, Albert, you fled Germany to get away from Hitler. Hitler may have the bomb, this very, very powerful weapon. We have to inform Roosevelt, and we write this. We're going to write a letter for you. If you sign it, read it and sign it, if you agree with it, and we'll get it to Roosevelt. And they did. And they had a buddy who was a banker who worked in the White House, and they made sure that Franklin Roosevelt got to see this letter. So that was about 1938. And basically, Roosevelt said, okay, I got to appoint a committee of scientists and start figuring out how to build one of these things ourselves. So everybody knew there was going to be a war with Germany at that point. They'd already had one. So basically, the development of nuclear weapons and the development of space travel and the idea of threats from outer space, it all happened at the same time in everyone's mind. And then, of course, World War II started. Oh, before that, there was a place called Cape Girardeau on the Mississippi River in Missouri. And in 1937, it's actually, I think it was 1941. It was the same year as Pearl Harbor, but it was in April of 41. Something crashed there. And they described the bodies as having, small, skinny bodies with, big heads and big eyes. It was the Greys that are very familiar to us. Everybody sees a picture now of a gray alien and they know what it means. So the US government arrived, took all of the crashed vehicle and all the bodies and took them away and swore everyone to secrecy. But Missouri, especially that part of Missouri, was close enough to St. Louis that Harry Truman who was part of the Masons, he would have known about it because the Masons
Well, they also had a
are.
picture. They had a picture of the ET floating around. The ET was
Oh yeah,
strung up, the body, like on like two police officers were holding it up,
yeah. I
and
think I've seen that picture.
it eventually
So,
disappeared. Like they weren't able to track it down.
no,
But
no,
one family
you
had
can't
it for
track
a
it down.
few. Yeah.
So the U.S. government knew that somebody was here snooping around. And this was done at the very highest levels of the U.S. government. They didn't go blabbing about it. And then, of course, the year previous to that, in 1938, um, just before World War II broke out in Europe, they had the Halloween War of the Worlds broadcast. And that revealed that the public, a certain fraction of the public, was terrified of the idea of an invasion from outer space. Remember, the United States had gone through World War I. It had fought in Europe. The United States felt invincible. They felt like they were the superpower on Earth, even back then.
Mm-hmm.
They'd fought in a European war. They'd done well. They only lost 100,000 men. And they thought, we're the mightiest power on Earth. But suppose somebody who's not of this Earth comes to threaten us. What are we going to do then? Maybe it'll be like the War of the Worlds of H.G. Wells. So these things were all in their back of the mind. And then this thing crashes at Cape Girardeau. And everyone was getting really tense anyway, because World War II by that time was raging in Europe. France had fallen. Dunkirk had happened. And, the Germans had bombed this city called Rotterdam and blown out the middle of it, just like in the levels of destruction. The only place you found that in fiction was in War of the Worlds. So the U.S. government was on edge. And of course, then by December, we got sucked into the war. Pearl Harbor happened. And they had a lot of warning about Pearl Harbor that was only, hindsight is 2020. They had all sorts of evidence that was going to happen. But the Japanese flooded the airwaves with fake messages and everything like this.
Mm-hmm.
So that it really, so we got surprised at Pearl Harbor. It sank most of our Pacific fleet. Thank God it sank it in Pearl Harbor so they could be, they raised those battleships. Most of them, I think only 2 of them were complete write-offs. So this government was suddenly at war. And then in 1940, so that was 41, 42, February 42, this Japanese submarine surfaces offshore of Long Beach. And the Japanese crew gets out, limbers up its deck gun. They lob a few shells into an oil refinery and set off a big fire in one of the oil storage tanks. And by this point, after Pearl Harbor, they had radar, they had all sorts of anti-aircraft guns set up. They thought the Japanese might launch carrier raids on LA by getting a ship across, a surprise carrier raid was not beyond the scope of their imagination after Pearl Harbor. So they just went into a frenzy. The Japanese just watched the fire for a while and decided to get back in their submarine and submerge. So, but then Los Angeles was just on a hair trigger after that. They got caught with their pants down. And so they're all sitting there. This is February 1942, a couple months after Pearl Harbor. The next night, and they have radar set up. The next night, they've tracked 4 targets on radar coming in from the ocean. Guess what they think they are? Japanese
Zeros.
carrier planes or Zeros or something. So they put all their anti-aircraft defenses on alert. I don't know why they didn't scramble any fighters, but or if they did, they didn't. Nobody, that didn't make the news. And so here comes these 4 targets in over LA, flying in nice straight lines, and they fly into a complete hornet's nest. I mean, suddenly they took no evasive action. They're sitting there in the searchlights getting hammered by 75 millimeter anti-aircraft guns and 50 caliber, which could reach them. And the story I heard is that 2 of those things actually got shot down. So as it turns out, not only were people from outer space then here, they were stupid. They weren't paying careful attention to come flying into, it was the alien version of a complete snafu. They fly right into this hornet's nest of air defenses, and they lose 2 ships. One of them crashed supposedly on Catalina Island. The other one crashed up in the national forest of LA, which is just basically chaparral. The Army
What's
picked
the
up one. The
source?
Navy picked.
What's the source for this information about the shoot downs? I've seen like pictures of the Battle of Los Angeles, but I've never read or seen
Oh
anything
well,
about these particular
there are
shoot downs.
there are accounts of some of them. People saw the ships headed for the ground. They had that nice picture of something trapped in the searchlights. It just sat there and got hammered, and apparently it wasn't bulletproof. And some of the witnesses said they saw a craft descending. I mean, they'd been flying along at a steady altitude, and suddenly they started descending. So, well, I was in Washington, D.C., and there was just a lot of scuttlebutt. I was working with the Pentagon and the agencies on, space work. And around the coffee machine and around the water cooler, you'd hear these stories. I can't remember who exactly told them. I heard a lot of interesting stuff. And, but, how much of it was just rumors and scuttlebutt, I don't know. You basically have to form what's called in the military intelligence an estimate of the situation. You have stuff that is recorded in the public record. You have scientific analysis, and then you have reports, some of which are not credible, some of which are credible. And you have to kind of take all of those and put them together and form what's called an estimate of the situation. You don't know exactly what reality is, but you're estimating what reality is. And so, so then the government then had more crashed vehicles and bodies after that, apparently, to add to the ones that from Cape Girardeau before the war. So now they realized, oh, 1 vehicle crashed at Cape Girardeau, and we had 4 vehicles over LA. And then the Foo Fighters thing started, especially in Europe. The British started seeing these Foo Fighters. And that actually comes from the word foe fighters, friend or foe. So they would call them Foo Fighters. They were unidentified, but they just said, well, they're probably foes. And they after the war, they found out the Germans were seeing them too, and they thought they were Allied secret weapons. And of course, the British and later the Americans thought they were Nazi secret weapons. Neither of them knew.
Mm-hmm.
So then things progress. Of course, we had World War II. 75 million people get killed in World War II. 8 million of them in death camps, dying horrifically. And one of the things about the death camps, it was all rumored to be true, but no one believed the rumors. No one believed that people could do stuff like that to people.
Oh, I thought it was 12 million.
Oh,
And then I
We
think
don't
the
know.
Russians, some
Oh,
subset was lost in the camps, and then
they
the
killed like
Russians lost like
30,
50
30.
million.
Oh, well,
Yeah,
yeah, if you
yeah.
count the Russian
It's like a
version,
wide range. It's like 27 to 50 million,
yeah, it
something like
was.
that.
I heard estimates the Russians lost 30 million troops and civilians in World War II. And so just horrendous loss of life, astronomical levels of destruction. And the only place anyone had ever seen in fiction such wholesale destruction of cities and massacre of civilians was in War of the Worlds. People forget the mental landscape that people lived in those days. No one had ever written a novel like War of the Worlds. H.G. Wells was heavily criticized for shocking people. He said, people said, this is the Victorian England. They said, why did you have to write such intense stuff? And so, anyway, World War II went through, and of course, then Oppenheimer and his buddies were working on the nuclear weapons, and they ended up dropping them on Japan to end the war. And everybody argues about that, but my my father was a combat veteran he flew in a bomber squadron. They lost 80% of their bomber squadron. He said, I only survived because of dumb luck. And my uncles on my mother's side, she had 3 brothers. They all served in combat infantry in combat. One of them did not come home. So that's what people were dealing with when the war ended. Nuclear weapons had suddenly appeared. The war was over, but people's nerves were still shot from the war. And they tested the first nuclear weapon down in New Mexico at a place called Trinity, near Alamogordo. And I talked to the daughters of the sheriff, and he had been out driving on patrol the night they set that thing off. And he said it lit up the sky like daylight. Roswell was 100 miles away, and it still lit up the sky like daylight. But it was a war. And so then the Air Force, the authorities said, oh, an ammunition camp blew up, ammunition dump. And that, it was a war. And so people just believed whatever the government told them because there was a war on, and they didn't ask any questions. So now, as it turns out, the fallout from that first nuclear weapons test, part of the fallout from that was plutonium, because not all the plutonium got burned up in the bomb. Only about, half of it at most. A bunch of it drifted over the town of Roswell. So the ground around Roswell had a lot of plutonium sitting there because it's only 100 miles from where the Trinity site was. And so they had very sensitive radiation gear in those days, and they mapped this. They mapped all the fallout and found out that Roswell was part of the fallout pattern. And guess where they decided to park all of their nuclear weapons after the war? They used plutonium. They used their plutonium. The first nuclear bomb they dropped was a little boy with uranium. They didn't even test it. They just built it and dropped it because they were so confident it would work. But the Nagasaki bomb was plutonium. That's the one they tested at Roswell. Plutonium, as it turns out, is easy to make, but hard to use as a nuclear weapons material. There's nothing classified about it. I'm talking, you can read this on Wikipedia. Uranium, enriched uranium, by the way, is very difficult to make, but easy to use. But anyway, once you know what you're doing, you can make plutonium bombs much cheaper than you can uranium bombs. So they've churned out 5 Nagasaki type bombs called the Fat Men. and they were all stored at Roswell. And you'd think, why did they store them at Roswell? Why didn't they take them to Wright-Patterson? Well, Roswell was isolated, but also had a lot of plutonium around in the soil. Where do you hide a penguin? Amongst a bunch of other penguins. Anyone who flies over with sensitive radiation detectors, like the Russians or somebody else, they're going to pick up plutonium, gamma rays. But it's part of a fallout pattern. If you see a little bit, if you have nuclear weapons that are under concrete, they're going to put out very little gamma rays. It's going to be very, very hard to see them. So this was kept utterly secret, that all the nuclear weapons on Earth were stored at Roswell. Okay, so it's 1947. The ruins at Dresden and Hiroshima and Nagasaki are still smoking. People are still burying dead people from the death camps. Everyone's nerves are shot. And you're coming up on the 4th of July weekend. But there's something else that's happened. Suddenly, there's this surge of UFO sightings all over the beginning in late June. This is where Ken Arnold spotted the first, what he called flying saucers, and everyone was seeing them. They were all over the country. Now, according to Philip Corso, who was Army intelligence, he said that they sighted a lot of them around the test sites at White Sands, where they were testing B-2 missiles, and near Roswell. So the government freaked out. By this time, they knew they were from outer space, and they thought, these aliens are interested in the most powerful weapon systems we have. Are they planning an invasion? And if so, are they going to neutralize our nuclear weapons so we can't fight back? I mean, if you're sitting in the Pentagon and getting these reports, that's what you think. And you've gone through Pearl Harbor, where you ignored warnings and reaped the world, and it was a disaster. So this time you're not going to be caught napping. I don't care where these people are from. They're not getting close to our nuclear weapon stockpile. All 5 of them. They were the only 5 nuclear weapons on Earth at the time. The Russians didn't have nuclear weapons yet. So there's this big flurry of UFO sightings, and it goes right through from late June, like starting June 20th. Everybody all over the country seeing them. According to Corso, they moved all the security they could to New Mexico to guard the the V2 launch sites, and the Trinity site where we tested our first nuclear, and also Roswell. So it's 4th of July weekend, and this motorcycle game called the Booze Fighters, apparently derived from Foo Fighter, show up in Hollister, California, take over the center of town, and have a drunken bash on Main Street before the National Guard shows up to drive them out. That's 4th of July. The same morning, apparently, they recover a crashed alien spacecraft at a place called Socorro, or it was actually the Plains of San Agustin near Socorro, New Mexico. Right now, the Plains of San Agustin is where they have the big radio telescope, the VLA. It was in the movie Contact. It's a bunch of radio telescopes all in a row so they can zero in on stuff in the sky. There's an archaeological group there and a irrigation ditch inspector. They see this thing, they wait, it's in the morning, and they see this crashed spacecraft. It's got a big hole in the side. There's dead aliens inside. There's dead aliens on the outside. This thing had a rough night, and it's crashed near Socorro. That's apparently on or about the morning of July 4th, Independence Day. And so they're sitting there looking at this, and suddenly all these deuce and a half trucks full of Army troops show up with this red-haired colonel with leather lungs, and he's screaming at everybody. They pick up the saucer, they pick up all the bodies, and they lined up the archaeological people and the irrigation inspector and say, this is completely secret. What you just saw here. If you go talking about it, we're gonna kill you and kill your families too. They actually threatened their families. This was maximum secrecy.
Mm-hmm.
And then they took off. So here's this red-haired colonel is screaming at everybody. He's in command. So that's like the morning of July 4th. In the meantime, near Roswell, New Mexico, 4 days later, Max Brazel is out near Corona, kind of to the north of Roswell. He finds a debris field of metal debris, thin metal. You could bend it with your fingers. It was very tough, but you could still, it was just metal. And it's all this wreckage. So he brings it into town and gives it to the sheriff. The sheriff doesn't know what to think. So he turns it over to the people at Roswell Air Base. Army, it was still part of the Army Air Corps, so they called it Roswell Army Airfield. He turns it into the base. They send out Jesse Marcel, Lieutenant Jesse Marcel, and the base intelligence officer, apparently OSS guy, CIA prototype. They go out, they find the debris field, and they get as much as they can and put it in their cars and take it home back to the base. Then they roust out everybody at the base, and the base commander, because everyone is seeing all these UFOs, and he has not been given any orders on this at all. He just notifies the newspapers and says, we got one. He's happy. So that comes out in the newspaper, July 8th. He gets an angry phone call from his superior, General Ramey, down in Texas, who bites his head off. It really gives him a royal ass chewing. But it was compartmentalized secret. He didn't know that they were worried about people from outer space, but apparently the troops were from Alamogordo. They were fully cognizant of a threat from outer space. And what had happened, so then they went out, they also found a second debris field, complete with bodies.
Mm-hmm.
There are also rumors that they found human bodies that had been mutilated in the wreckage. So this was really bad. And guess who shows up at Roswell Army Air Base? A red-haired colonel with leather lungs. Everybody talked about him. They said this guy was just apoplectic all the time. He stayed in a constant state of rage and basically took over the base. And he actually the base commander was just a colonel, and this guy was apparently a senior colonel. Had rank on him, and he also had orders from General Ramey. So they organized the entire base to process all this wreckage. They had the people I talked to described girders, I-beam girders with strange writing on them, and all these metal plates that you could actually put together like Legos in some cases. And so they reconstructed at one point, they said, kind of a saucer-shaped vehicle out of all this wreckage, because a lot of it kind of just fit together, tongue and groove. And then the rumors were they also found bodies, and they got the local undertaker to come and embalm them. And then they flew everything out to Texas, the air base in Texas near Fort Worth. And then the red-haired colonel and his whole team left. and the and the base commander was really a well-liked guys. These are guys who were all World War II veterans. All of them were like above 6 feet tall. These guys were the real cream of the Army Air Corps bomber groups. They were all World War II veterans, and the colonel was very well liked. Anyway, and they'd have these base meetings. They'd have a meeting of all the officers on base every Monday. So everything's in turmoil for 2 weeks, and then finally everybody leaves. They take all the stuff, and then they have a meeting, of just the base. Everything kind of returns to sort of normal on the base. And they said, and I talked to the people who were there. They were, senior officers on base. So they had this meeting with the base commander, and one of them he basically said, "Well, what's on the schedule for this week? Things like this." And then one of the officers asked the colonel, "What about? Do you have any comments about what happened last week?" And the colonel just grinned and said, "Boy, did we screw up," he said. That's all he said. So you've got something blew up in midair near Roswell, made 2 big debris fields, complete with bodies. Something crashed. And by the way, the coyotes and the vultures had actually been at these bodies. They were, as you would expect in New Mexico, they'd sit out there under the sun for 4 days after 4th of July. So then you think to yourself, okay, there was a crash near Socorro that was recovered immediately by the military, apparently on the morning of July 4th or thereabouts. And then they found 2 debris fields at Roswell 4 days later. What happened? Why would the aliens lose 2 ships in one night over Roswell? So then you say, well, people say, oh, they were struck by lightning because there was a big lightning storm. Lightning strikes planes all the time. The lightning rides right on the metal skin. It doesn't go inside if the plane is designed right. It rides on the skin and then jumps off and goes to ground or wherever it wants to go. It happens all the time. And planes do not crash when they get hit by lightning, unless they're made by Boeing, apparently. But let's just say that a well-built aircraft, these had been flying through tropical thunderstorms since World War II. They knew they were not afraid of lightning at all, or even high winds. So then you say, well, maybe did they run into radar beams? Radar beams do not make ships explode. They don't make ships explode, and they don't punch big holes in other ships either. These are radar beams. Radar beams are like, microwaves. They just, try heating a hamburger in a microwave oven when it's wrapped in tinfoil. It won't get warm at all. You'll get a light show, but you won't. The microwaves just bounce off the thin metal. They don't go into it at all. So what would bring down 2 alien craft so that one would crash with a big hole in it and dead aliens inside and outside, spilling out of apparently some of them just stumbled out or crawled out of the vehicle and then died on the ground. And then you had all this debris field. What could cause that? And you're talking about people who've come here from many light years away. Supposedly their technology is quite advanced. Well, as it turns out, the answer's in Corso. He doesn't say this explicitly, but they were patrolling the sky over Roswell. In those days, they had jet fighters. The P-80 Shooting Star had a bunch of 50 caliber machine guns on it, but it could only fly during the day. It didn't have any radar. They couldn't fly it at night. The only thing that they had for a night fighter was a twin engine propeller plane called the P-61 Black Widow. It was painted glossy black because they found that if you're flying a night fighter around and people are searching for you with searchlights, it's better to have a glossy black covering than like a matte black. So there were P-60. That was the night fighter that the Air Force had 2 years after World War II, and they would have had veteran crews from World War II. The thing had a big radar dish in its nose, and they could actually shoot down planes without even seeing them using the radar. The thing carried 4 20-millimeter cannons on the bottom of the fuselage, and then a turret on top with 4 50 caliber machine guns. So this thing could hit like a hammer. And what they'd learned to do during the war was they'd fly through thunderstorms, and they'd get vectored in by ground radar to intercept something coming in, and
Mhm.
then they track it on their own radar, and then when they got 4 or 5 miles from it, they'd turn off their radar because the Germans and the Japanese had radar detectors on their planes. So they turn off their radar, and they had special night vision binoculars. And they would come in and do the last phase of the attack visually. So there would be no warning. So what happened apparently is there were a shoot down of 2 alien spacecraft over Roswell. Because the government was absolutely determined to protect our nuclear weapons. They didn't want the aliens stealing them. They didn't want the air aliens trying to deactivate them. They didn't want the aliens to even know how many we had. They wanted that utterly protected. So they gave shoot on sight orders to these night fighters. They may have lost some night fighters in the process, but at least one of the night fighters got got 2 of the ships. And by the way, because it was a night full of a lot of thunderstorms, which usually peak early in the evening and then they calm down, but it's still raining. If you're trying to detect gamma rays from the plutonium in these nuclear weapons, and they're stored underground, so the gamma rays are very weak. You're getting a very weak signal. Even I don't care what kind of technology you got, you don't have a very good signal. Not only that, but there's a lot of plutonium in the soil. So you have what's called poor signal to noise. So what you do in a circumstance like that, you have to fly 2 spacecraft along. One of them basically establishes the noise floor, and the other one establishes the difference from the noise floor. And they both got to fly fairly close together. I mean, that's just simple physics. I don't care if these people are from outer space. Gamma rays are gamma rays. That's the only way you could detect, and you can detect plutonium bombs by their gamma rays.
Mhm.
So, by the way, depleted uranium, your enriched uranium, much more difficult to detect because plutonium is a more unstable element. So you have these 2 vehicles. They're flying through rain. There's still some lightning activity, creating a lot of E&M noise. They're getting a big background of gamma rays from the soil, and they're hunting for a concentration of gamma rays from Roswell base. So they're trying to fly close to it. They can see the base. They know where they got the base mapped out. So they're flying close to it. They're flying close together, and they're flying at low altitude because there's a lot of rain, and the rain absorbs the gamma rays. So this is the perfect storm if somebody swoops down on you with a World War II night fighter using night binoculars and hits you with 20 millimeter cannons and 50 caliber machine gun bullets that are explosive, then you go down. And one of them apparently blew up. And when something blows up like that, especially in those days, the radar wasn't very good. So you would just see it would disappear from radar. There would probably be a bright flash. And so the guys flying the night fighter would just see probably a bright flash when it got hit. And then and they would instinctively shut their eyes, but some of them would wear eye patches over one eye so they could preserve their night vision when they blew up stuff. These guys were so good, they only lost one of these planes in combat during World War II. They were a very good plane. And they were so rugged, they used them to investigate thunderstorms after the war. They would fly them right through the center of thunderstorms because they were built very tough. They were actually also used as light bombers at night. They would hit trains. It was a very good plane. They only lost one of them in combat. They brought down at least 300 German and Japanese night fighters who had their own radar. And they would sneak up, but our radar was better. It was made by the British and MIT. So that is what happened at Roswell. It was a military clash. And it set the entire tone. Now the government, you've heard many reports of the aliens being interested in nuclear weapons and tampering with them, trying to interfere with them, and watching our nuclear weapons tests and nuclear rocket carrying rocket tests of ICBMs. The government then knew that they were trying to scope out our most powerful weapon systems. And what does the government do? It doesn't know anything. It doesn't know how many aliens are here. Could they be planning an invasion like in War of the Worlds? They don't know. They don't know. This could be just a first wave that they're experiencing. And of course, everyone is seeing them all over the planet, at that point. So that's what happened. The government reacted, as they say, very forcefully against the UFOs trying to investigate the nuclear weapons stockpile. And this is the first time the aliens had done this, was try to investigate our nuclear weapons stockpile. So the government reacted in a very paranoid manner because it was only 2 years after World War II, and they didn't want a War of the Worlds scenario. And apparently the crew that brought it down, they were given medals and commendations and told that, they had been flown in from California. That's where the night fighters were based. By the way, they called all the night fighters in from Germany and Japan just before the big UFO surge happened. So it's like the government knew it was going to happen. They brought all the night fighters in from overseas to the United States. So just prior, they brought them in May and June. So that was what was patrolling the skies over Roswell, and that's what got those two craft. I mean, face it, radar beams do not bring down aircraft, human aircraft, and neither does lightning. But cannon shells and 50 caliber rounds do bring down things. They make them explode, and they put big holes in them and kill people on board. So that's what happened, guys. So what happened then, this set the tone for our dealings with the little gray aliens. Now,
well, let's just raise just a quick question. After Roswell, presumably we couldn't talk to these guys. We couldn't do anything with diplomacy because they just showed up and started surreptitiously or out in the open surveilling our military industrial complex.
Absolutely. They were casing the joint.
At what point did we start to get intelligence about their origin, what their intentions were? Like, how long did that take, do you think?
Well, what happened? In the meantime, the Russian, we had a Cold War going with the Russians. That had started already. And so and then the Russians got nuclear weapons, like in about 1951. They got their first atomic bomb. And so then they were building bombs like crazy, and so were we. And we built finally the hydrogen bomb. And so we were in an arms race with the Russians. And the Russian attitude toward UFOs was they assumed any unknown aircraft flying over Russia was either British or American. So they would scramble MiGs and chase them. And finally, they brought one down near one of their top secret labs, kind of their version of Los Alamos. And they pried open the hatch. Nie Amerikanski. These aren't Americans. Are they French? Are they British? No. But the Russians had no interest in talking to the aliens. And then we started getting human mutilations, by the way. The first case was in a place called White Sands. A guy was abducted in broad daylight by a flying saucer named Jonathan Lovett. He was a sergeant. His superior, a major, saw it happen. They didn't find his body for a week. It was 10 miles away from where he had been last seen. He was mutilated just like a cow. His eyes were gouged out. Tongue was cut out. Rectum, genitalium. It was horrible. The same thing happened to a bunch of Russian snow hikers. A party of 9 of them were hiking up in the mountains, and they were sitting in a tent, all cozy. I mean, these people are Russians. Who else would go out hiking in the middle of
this is the Dyatlov.
Dyatlov Pass. Something scared these people so bad that they sliced open their own tent and escaped out the side in stocking. They didn't even put on their shoes. They went out into a snowstorm, 30 Fahrenheit below, with no shoes, and in some cases, not even socks. So there were 9 of them. 6 of them they found frozen to death. The other 3 they found later, and they had been mutilated. Same pattern as Lovett and the cows. I'm not going to go into all the details. And also the Russians, these are Russian reports, basically KGB reports. So the Russians lost a bunch of people in 1956 up in the mountains. And these are people who got attacked when they were in isolated areas. I mean, they didn't land in some air base and try and take it over. No, they hit small groups of people, mostly unarmed people, and killed them. And that's all our government needed to know. And so we basically, here's how things evolved. Apparently, like the rumor is that Kennedy, when he finally, well, first of all, Eisenhower became president. Oh, then, by the way, then the Korean War is going on. Suddenly we got UFOs flying over Washington, D.C. in 1952. And everyone can see them. And they're seen on all the radars. And the government says it's thermal inversions, and this is a classic geopolitical intimidation. Overfly the capital of your people you're trying to intimidate. When Cory Aquino in the Philippines was being overthrown by a military coup, the United States scrambled all its fighters and had them fly over Manila in big formations. This intimidated all of the coup people to go back to their barracks. Forget the whole thing. the Israelis just flew over Beirut, Lebanon, at supersonic speeds and made a whole bunch of sonic booms. This is to impress the people up there that they don't want a war with Israel. So this is a class overflying the capital. So basically, then things evolved. Both sides developed so much nuclear stockpiles we could actually destroy the Earth. And apparently, according to Corso, there was a secret agreement between the Russians and the United States that if the aliens tried to take this planet, we would wage nuclear war against them and destroy the entire planet. We would commit racial suicide rather than allow the aliens to have this planet intact. It would be a radioactive wasteland. So that was a secret treaty we had with the Russians. And then, of course, Kennedy may have been trying to make an more open alliance with the Russians. And, he was assassinated. Apparently, he was going to give a speech talking about the UFO cover-up, and he was killed the same day. So, and this isn't how the government is supposed to run things. It's supposed to talk about this stuff. But, I mean, these secret agreements, later we made one with the Greys, apparently in the late 60s. Remember, suddenly, it was about the time of the Vietnam War was going on. We were losing the Vietnam War. We're doing fine militarily, but support for the war in this country had just evaporated. We wanted it done with. And so Johnson, sometime around the Johnson-Nixon transition, they apparently invited the gray aliens to come to Holloman Air Force Base at Alamogordo, once again near White Sands, and had a face-to-face with them. And
how did they do that though? Like when did they start?
I guess they just talked to them by radio. They just kept talking to them when they fly over, and there were a lot of UFO sightings around White Sands. And and it says in the Constitution, if you're going to have a treaty with somebody, it's got to be negotiated with the advice and consent of the Senate by ambassadors that the Senate has approved.
Yep.
And then it's got to be debated and ratified by the Senate to be enforced. Well, those were considered minor details at the time. It's sort of like a desperate times require desperate measures. They just made this deal under the table. And the aliens said they wanted to abduct some people and take sperm and egg samples because they were investigating our genes. Okay. They said they'd give us lists of people. They also said they were going to give us all this technology, it's warp drive, death ray, all this good stuff. And so that was the agreement that happened. And what happened then is apparently that got celebrated. Then, right after that happened, guess what? Project Blue Book went out of business. If you saw a UFO, you can't call anybody anymore in the Air Force. Oh, we're not interested. Suddenly, there is no more Project Blue Book. They released the Condon report saying, it's nothing here to see, folks. Mind your own business. These aren't the droids you're looking for. And so
you're saying that happened because we had a treaty. So we just didn't.
Suddenly we had a treaty.
So suddenly we were uninterested in.
Suddenly, well, it's all being handled behind the scenes. Sort of like, don't bother us with the reports. We're handling this. And so, yes, and this is not a constitutional, this was a breach of the Constitution to do this. But they
which intelligence agency was running this whole, excuse my language, shit show?
I have no idea. I don't know who was running this shit show. It was, you know, the agency may in fact be so secret that its name is not even known publicly. There are agencies out there like that. Well, for example, the
So you're
National
saying
Reconnaissance
outside
Office.
of the, it could be something that's outside of the 19 publicly acknowledged agencies.
Exactly. Well, like the NRO, National Reconnaissance Office, runs all our spy satellites. It was an agency that was so classified that nobody even knew its name. The only reason it got unclassified is they had a budget surplus and they
And
built
this
these
is,
fancy.
and it was like, it was classified for like 30 years, right? Like 3
Oh
decades.
yes, and they had accumulated a big budget surplus, and they kind of outgrew their building, so they decided to build this fancy new building out by Dulles Airport. I worked across the street from it, and this thing was, I mean, we're talking mirrored glass and chrome, and it was a fancy. And apparently, uh, congressional staffers, because they're driving to Dulles Airport, noticed this fancy building, and kind of got curious as to who owns this building. And they stopped by, and there was no signs outside saying who owned it, and they finally deduced that the NRO, without any approval from anyone, they were supposed to go to Congress to get, do something like this. They just went and built themselves a fancy new building and didn't tell anybody because they had a budget surplus. It was they considered it not using money that was appropriated to build satellites to build a fancy new building, complete with, executive lounges, stuff like this. I was never in the building, and I worked at the building across the street from it, and the people were so used to it, the police being classified, highly classified, they still wouldn't say its name, even though it was now unclassified. They had a big sign out that says not NRO, National Reconnaissance Office. And I'd say, where are you going today? Because we would be sent to places to do work for the Air Force. And they'd say, I'm going across the street. Instead of saying I'm
NSC
going to the,
was also classified for some period of time, just
what's
not as
that?
long as the NRO.
Was
The
that?
NSC, the
Oh,
NSC
yeah.
was
No,
also
no.
classified
Well,
for a
then
while.
the NS
Yeah.
and the NSA too was classified. No such
Or sorry, that's
agency.
what I meant.
Yeah,
That's what I meant.
yeah. The
NSA.
NSA was
Yeah.
completely classified. No one even knew its name. Didn't know it existed. So there's some agency out there that handles this. And so what happened? Hollywood. There's a lag time in Hollywood. Something will happen, and Hollywood is always plugged into what happens in DC. There's this big fiber optic bundle that runs from Hollywood under the country to Langley and so what they did is they made the movie Close Encounters of the Third Kind. And what does it celebrate? This big secret meeting with the little aliens. And oh, everyone is so happy. And they return the pilots from the missing flight over, all of this stuff. So that happened. And I hated that movie because to me, the aliens were terrorizing people. And but anyway, so yes, so everything is sweetness and light. This is Spielberg makes this movie. And then it became apparent that things were not going according to plan, as it turns out. The aliens were not following the agreement they had made. For one thing, they weren't giving us any good stuff. Warp drive, death ray, all that stuff, they weren't giving it to us. They were giving us little trinkets, and they were abducting far more people than were on the list. And some of them were not coming back. Not only that, the animal mutilation started. And they're cutting up people's cows and leaving them for them to find. And that's a very standard terrorization technique in a lot of countries, by the way. You cut up somebody's cow and you put a note on it, say, you're next if you don't play ball. And so apparently then what happened, so it got celebrated in this movie, Close Encounters of the Third Kind. And Then we had joint bases, apparently. We let the aliens have bases on Earth. And one of them was in a place called Dulce, New Mexico, under this mesa called Archuleta Mesa. And there were a lot of animal mutilations in the area, and people saw a lot of UFOs, but nobody knew there was this hidden base, underground base. And Jimmy Carter had become president. And the first thing, he'd seen a UFO. He was at a restaurant with his wife and a bunch of other people who were sitting on a patio, and they saw this big UFO. And so everybody else in the restaurant saw it too. So he reported that, and he wanted to know, when he became president, if there was a UFO cover-up. And no one would tell him anything. So here he is sitting in the Oval Office, realizing that he's maybe captain of the ship, but there's stuff going on below decks that he doesn't know anything about, and no one will tell him. That's until 1978, apparently late in 1978. Apparently he was sitting in the Oval Office. He's a nuclear engineer. He's a smart guy, former submarine guy, but he's also a peanut farmer and a one-term governor of Georgia. One term.
Mm-hmm.
Suddenly, a bunch of generals, a bunch of high-ranking military people and people from the officials from the intelligence agencies show up at the White House, and they come to the Oval Office, say, "Mr. President, we have to talk to you about something urgent." And he says, very good. What is it? And they said, the UFO aliens that we have a secret treaty with? Well, we let them occupy jointly a base in New Mexico, and they had a bunch of human captives there, and our special forces tried to rescue the human captives, and there was a big firefight with aliens, and a whole bunch of people are dead, and a whole bunch of aliens are dead. And so, Mr. President, this is a bad situation. We want to know what to do.
By the way, how many people? How many people reported this incident at Dulce? I know that there was Phil Snyder, but he's a little suspect. But there were
Phil Snyder
two
is
or three
dead.
Others, right?
Phil Snyder is dead now. After telling people, he told people the government had approached him and told him to shut up, and he wouldn't shut up. So I talked to Leonard Stringfield. Unfortunately, has passed on, and he had close contacts with people in the UFO cover-up. He said he'd heard 3 different versions of what had happened. And
this is why I'm asking the question, because I don't want it to rely all on Phil Snyder, right?
Oh, no. I got this information. The first time I heard it was from John Lear. John Lear was talking to Billy Mitchell, Jimmy Doolittle, and Lear flew Air America for the CIA, so he was well connected, and he talked about it a lot. And Leonard Stringfield, I talked to him on the phone, and he said, well, he'd heard 3 different versions, and he basically said it's typical of a combat situation, especially under these circumstances, that you get differing accounts of what happened, because nobody can put it all together, especially people who are on site. And he said the only thing different between the stories he heard was the body count, ranging from 60 to 80 to 100 humans and aliens. And he said it was I spoke to him about 1992. That was basically 15 years after this supposed incident had occurred. By the way, Jimmy Carter, according to one account, broke into tears when they told him this. I mean, from going from not knowing anything about the UFO cover-up to suddenly being hit with this right in the face, he was in shock for a few minutes. And then he regained his composure and said, well, we don't have any more agreements with these aliens, do we? We shoot them on sight now. We're at war with them. So they issued a shoot on sight war we went back to shoot on site with the Greys. But in the meantime, we'd also gotten a lot of contact with other alien groups. Apparently, like it's a zoo out there. I mean, they seem to come in three basic groups. There's the Greys, kind of gray type aliens, short little gray guys with big heads, or even sometimes tall, skinny ones with heads, with big eyes and heads. And then there's aliens reported widely that look and act just like us. You could walk by them on the street. People call them Nordics. The first Nordic that appeared in the movies was in Walt Disney made a movie called Moon Pilot. And it's this woman, she has auburn hair and brown eyes. She doesn't look Nordic. And I heard in Washington, D.C. from various sources that this was considered a security problem because they could not tell these people from terrestrial human beings.
How do we know that Nordics weren't seeded by the Greys using our genetic material?
We don't really know that, but it doesn't look like it because apparently they don't get along with the Greys at all. They apparently are a different group and they have their own starships, and they're our cousins, apparently. We're all part, well, I prefer to call them Pleiadian or Pleiadian. They're apparently helping to protect us. They're friendly. The Greys are unfriendly. And then there's these lizard men who are very rarely reported, but if you want to know what they look like, or remember that Star Trek episode where Kirk had to battle this lizard man on some planet.
The Gorm or something.
Yeah, I mean, these people look like they stand about 7 feet tall. They're quite formidable looking, and they look like dinosaurs. You would imagine a dinosaur would look if it evolved into an intelligent being. You know, hardly any tail, walks upright like a miniature Tyrannosaurus Rex. And so, I mean, it's a gross oversimplification to say there are only three basic types out there: reptilians, Greys, and then basically humans who are transterrestrial. They're not. By the way, the Pleiadians hate the Draconians, the lizard people. Apparently, they have a long-standing conflict with them. And what do you find in the Bible? Well, the story is the story from numerous reports is that the Pleiadians said we didn't live in the Pleiades originally. We lived in a place in constellation Lyra, the lyre, which is a harp, and it's right next to the constellation Draco. And we got driven out of our home world by the Draconians, and we've been at war with them ever since. And this was something like the original Battlestar Galactica. And guess what? In the Bible, you got the story of Garden of Eden, Adam and Eve getting kicked out of the garden because of an intelligent reptile. And in the folklore of the West, at least, dragons are highly intelligent and very powerful. And they're not just snakes. They're very powerful, smart animals. That's their traditional dragon. And so apparently this is a garbled version of apparently what happened. It's been and then of course the dragon is a symbol of evil in Revelations. So it's a symbol of evil in the Genesis all the way to Revelations. Is the dragon is a symbol of evil, and they're smart. They're not dumb lizards. These are smart people. So what it looks like, Sean, is we have a whole bunch of different types of people out there, as you would expect. We're not alone in the universe. Some of them are very friendly, and you would expect it to because they look just like us, or in fact, we look like them. They predate us. And what do we find on Mars? We find a dead civilization, and the faces are human faces. They don't look like dragons. They don't look like grays. They look like us. And that stuff on Mars is probably from before the dinosaurs. And somebody nuked them.
What about the asteroid belt?
Oh, the asteroid belt, it could be a planet that they could have had like two large planets in that zone, and they ran into each other finally. And the asteroid belt is constantly spreading in time. It's a pot that's being stirred gravitationally by the gravity of Jupiter, and to some smaller extent by Mars. So it's constantly being spread out in time. It's probably only 1% of what it used to be. It used to be a lot thicker. And most of the asteroid belt ended up on Jupiter, which doesn't have a solid surface, so you don't see any craters or anything. But on Mars, Mars is next to the asteroid belt. In fact, Mars defines the inner edge of the asteroid belt. So any asteroid that kind of starts wandering, disturbed by Jupiter's gravity, if it doesn't run into Mars, then it'll get by Mars and run into us. So Mars is kind of our tin roof, basically, to absorb a lot of asteroids that would otherwise hit us. So, so we have three main types. So the situation is this: we apparently have kindred in the stars, we're basically their cousins genetically. We can have children with them, apparently. And those children can't even be called hybrids. If somebody with copper blood, like the grays apparently have copper blood. That's why they look gray, because copper-based blood is blue. Iron-based blood is pink. It gives you a pink color. So the Pleiadians are pink. The grays are gray because they have apparently the copper-based oxygen carrier. I mean, hemoglobin is based on iron. Hemocyanin is based on copper. And it's used by the octopus and horseshoe crabs and a lot of other animals. And it looks like laundry detergent, their blood. And because it's kind of bluish, but it makes you have a gray appearance, especially. So anyway, so we have a low intensity conflict going with the grays, apparently. Now, Ronald Reagan gets to be president. What does he announce? 4 times he announces to the world, I've often wondered what we would do if we were threatened for an invasion from outer space. He says that 4 times. Wouldn't us and the Russians get together to repel that invasion? Then you notice after a while, after saying that, the Cold War ends abruptly. Suddenly, we're making nice with the Russians. The Cold War ended with amazing swiftness. Of course, the Russians were under pressure because of Afghanistan and stuff like this. But why did they collapse so quick? Why did we suddenly get together and make nice with the Russians after having a Cold War? It's because apparently we were threatened by a possibility of an invasion from outer space, and we'd entered into a military alliance with them. There's one shot I saw that I always stuck in my mind. It's this big he's chief of naval operations. They're on the deck of this aircraft carrier, sitting next to him in a nice, comfortable chair, lawn chair kind of thing, is Akramirov. He's the Russian Minister of Defense. He's a World War II veteran. He's watching this flyover by all our jets, The guy is grinning from ear to ear. This is the Russian. He thinks this is just a great. He doesn't, he's this, unsmiling Russian stoic face they have. Oh, no, not at all. This guy is having a good day. And, and we helped the Russians a lot get through the transition to the end of the Cold War. And, and of course, things snowballed over there. They didn't just get rid of the Cold War, they got rid of communism, and it's, I'm trying to, and I'm trying to say a lot. I'm trying to you should read the book. I go through all of this in the book. And I'm sorry.
And you can find it on Amazon right now, right?
Right. You can get it in print or, or Kindle. And I'm very proud of the book. And the important thing is to think that, okay, we have a good destiny ahead of us. By the way, we have so many nuclear weapons. And when the Cold War ended, do you think they got rid of the nuclear weapons? No. They put them on a shelf someplace, just in case of a rainy day. The Russians and the Americans they took the missiles, took the nuclear weapons off their missiles and just stored them. And so we are still have 10 times more nuclear weapons than we need to destroy this planet completely and make it into radioactive alien. I want to remind you of a quote from Dune, Frank Herbert. He who can destroy a thing can control a thing. If we have our finger on the nuclear trigger, aliens can't invade. Mm-hmm. Not only will they risk an interstellar war with the Pleiadians, but the Earth will end up in a nuclear war on Earth. Earth will turn into a radioactive wasteland. It'd be worthless. So we are, in fact, reasonably safe right now, but we do have to end the UFO cover-up. I'm convinced of that. As it says it also in Dune, the sleeper must awaken. We must wake up to reality. We're not alone in the universe. By the way, the best example of a society coming out of an isolation like we're in now and embracing the larger world is Japan. Japan went from basically being a medieval society in about 1870 to by the time of 1900, they had modernized, they had trains, they had good warships. They learned all about Western science. They picked out the best and brightest scholars in Japan and sent them to Oxford and Harvard. And so the Japanese, I mean, of course, they became they became an imperialistic military power, just like all the European places, just like all the European countries. But the Japanese managed to take their society from being basically a medieval society, but highly organized and respecting intellectual scholarship, and turn it into a modern state in about 30 years, one generation.
Quick question, not to change the topic too much, but somebody's asking if you can give any thoughts on the year 2027. There's also been various reports it's 2026, but since the CIA, former CIA employee Jim Semivan thinks there's something ominous on the horizon in that year.
Well, got to remember, this government has been worried about something being on the horizon. Let's call it an Independence Day scenario. By the way, I think they named Independence Day because that's when Roswell happened. That's when the shoot downs happened. It was approximately the night of the very early morning, early AM of Independence Day in 1947. I mean, they only found the wreckage 4 days later from one of the craft, but the first craft apparently crashed on the morning of July 1st, July 4th. So I think this government has been very nervous for a long time about this. I can understand if I was the government. I mean, we're dealing with such vast unknowns. We don't know how many, what are the alien forces out there? How much stuff do they have?
Well, they certainly squandered the last fucking 80 years, right?
Oh,
Well,
I know.
I mean, like I have zero sympathy for these people. None. We could
You
have
mean the aliens or the
completely
government?
reorganized human society over the last 80 years to get prepared for anything, right? Excuse my
I know.
language, but I have.
I know. Well, we are very well armed. You notice we always keep our own military. There are two militaries on Earth of superpowers that are used to fighting. And I mean, they keep the knives sharp, the bayonet sharp. That's the United States and the Russians.
Yeah, then there's the
And
world's largest army, which is the
oh,
300
that
million guns
I'm
that are in the
sorry.
United States.
The
Outside
last
of
time,
outside of China.
I'm sorry, the last time the People's Republic of China actually got in a war with somebody, they invaded Vietnam, North Vietnam, and it was a disaster. They lost like 200,000 men. They got 20 miles into the country, and the North Vietnamese had a veteran, they'd been fighting us, and they had good Russian artillery. Their artillery outranged all of the Chinese artillery. And the jet fighters, they had MiG-21s that outclassed everything the Chinese had. Chinese can't make good jet engines, as it turns out. They typically fly their jet engines for 8 hours and then scrap them. And the Russians, strangely enough, will not sell them their latest jet fighters with the latest engines on them. The Chinese and the Russians hate each other. Look, the Russians, for all their faults, we know they can fight. We know they're smart. We know they can fight. We know we can fight. The British, the Germans, the Italians. We got the Israelis as allies. We got the Japanese. I don't view the Chinese as a major military power at this point. I mean, maybe they can parade well, but they can't. They're having basically a purge of all their military now. The guy who runs China now is so paranoid, apparently, that the very guys he decided to put in charge of the military, he's now having them arrested and executed. Guy's paranoid as hell.
Yeah, and they're not giving him any information, so everything because they're worried of how he'll react. So right now he's operating on. They're also not publishing major like economic estimates and things like that. So
no,
he really has no idea what's going on in his own country.
The heroine in my novel, the chief heroine in my novel called Morningstar Pass: The Collapse of the UFO Cover-Up, which is going to be made into a big movie someday. And I'm actually quoting someone who was Chinese that I talked to once. They're Chinese American. They said, well, China, she says, this is the heroine in the novel. She says, China invented the compass, paper, belt buckles, gunpowder, and built the Great Wall of China. Those are its great accomplishments. She says, on the other hand, they invented foot binding, complete disorganization. They can't even agree on a spoken language. There is no Chinese language. She says it's all,
Yeah, you got like Wu, Shanghainese,
yeah, Hunan,
Mandarin,
all that stuff, and she
Cantonese,
says,
and those are just four off the top of my head.
so they had foot binding for women, and they had night soil tax. They taxed how much, poop you had because it was used as fertilizer. The government even started taxing that. And they also built the Great Wall of China. She counted that as both a negative and a positive, because they say every stone in the Great Wall of China cost a human life to build. So China has, I mean, their scientists and scholars are just brilliant, but that's kind of individually. But then collectively, their society just blunders from one disaster after another. The Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution. And now this, they had it made financially. Imagine having a store where customers show up and you stop them at the door and take all their stuff and rough them up. And then you're amazed that no one shops at your store after a while. That's what the Chinese had, a winning formula for being an economic superpower, and they destroyed it. Their factories, they got all this abandoned real estate. It's like some science fiction movie, but it turns out it's very typical of Chinese history that they will, when things go off the deep end in China, they really go off the deep end.
Quick
And the
question.
last time they did a military operation was against the Vietnamese, and the Vietnamese cleaned their clocks for 2 weeks. And the Chinese just pulled back into China and said, well, we taught them a lesson,
Quick question. What was your the article that you published in that Indian journal? Where can people find that really quickly?
The Indian journal? Which journal? Which scientific journal?
I can't remember.
Which article are you referring to?
That's a good question. I think there's something you recently published in an Indian journal. It may have been.
Well, it was the fact that the guy from Harvard, they scooped up this
yeah, it was your analysis of the materials that they found off the coast of New Guinea. Yeah,
and it had
where can they
nuclear
find
weapon
that?
components in it. It had nuclear weapons components in it. So somebody was flying around out there with nuclear weapons on board, and somebody zapped them apparently, and they crashed on Earth. And at least that's what it looks like happened. I can't.
Where can people find that article if they want to read it?
I can. Let's see. Do you have a website or anything I can post it on? I'd have to track it.
Yeah, just if you go to my
YouTube, just go. Failed Orion type probe, Brandenburg, on the internet. It'll pop up. Fail, because another way you could interpret it was an Orion type spacecraft, Orion drive, which sets off nuclear weapons to propel yourself near the speed of light. And it's possible that that's what it was, and it was headed for Earth, and something went wrong. Here's all these really smart aliens from outer space, and they crash all the time. The stories I heard was they had crashed. They had so many crashed spaceships. Finally, so many bodies. They just quit collecting bodies because if you do autopsies on 2 or 3 of them, the basic types, then you basically know it. And unless it was something of an unusual appearance, they just wouldn't even bother. They would just burn the bodies and bury the ashes on site and take away all the hardware. That's what I heard. They had so many bodies, they quit doing autopsies on them.
So, given all this, how do you anticipate disclosure is going to proceed going forward?
Well, I think we're going to have to convince ourselves that we can do this thing, that we're safe because we have all our nuclear weapons. Believe it or not, the very ferocity of human beings, that we will fight to the death. If we see no percentage in surrendering to somebody like the Greys, there's no percentage in that. We'll fight to the death, and we'll take as many of them with us as we can. We have all these nuclear weapons that we can just set off on. If you want to deny the Earth to somebody, you can just set off the nuclear weapons on the ground. It makes maximum fallout, and it destroys the Earth for thousands of years. Nobody can live here. So it's like wiring your house with dynamite because you think the bank is going to try and foreclose on it, and you make it so you can just light it with a Ronson lighter fuse, no electronic stuff. So we're quite safe right now, and we also have our kindred in the stars, and we have "In God We Trust" on our money. So we're safe, but we must move toward disclosure. So that what you can expect is a bunch of Hollywood movies basically explaining the same sort of things I've explained, that not everybody out there is nice. Give up on that, but there is a group of people out there who are very nice, and we will join kind of a galactic federation someday, and our future will look like Star Trek. And we're quick learners. The human
John,
race is a bunch of quick learners.
How can people contact you if they have questions?
I'm on X, at PhD Brandenburg, or at Brandenburg PhD, and you can send me messages on X. And I think that's the best way to do that right now. And so anyway, so I've written this book, which is basically an outline of a secret history of the UFO cover-up. I'm going to try and do a book where it goes into more detail, but right now I'm trying to give people the basic facts. And I truly believe our future is going to look like Star Trek. In Star Trek, remember, the Vulcans came and befriended the human race. Remember, there was a movie, First Contact. And by the way, if people follow me on X, they can send me messages. I can follow them. If they follow me, I can follow them, and just post a message in response to one of my X messages saying I'd like to talk to you, and I can respond to that, and we can set up a communication. So I think we're going to be fine. We're through the worst of this. When the Greys first arrived, and they're the problem, I mean, the universe is full of nice people and bad people. The nice people are easy to deal with. The bad people, they're difficult. So we've gotten through the difficulties of dealing with the bad people for 80 years. I mean, you have to give the government some credit. When the Greys first arrived, we had no space travel. We had no nuclear weapons. We had no laser beams. We had no advanced computers. We had nothing. We've gained all of that since they arrived. Some of it we've gathered from the wreckage of the ships that have crashed here. And a lot of brave men have died doing night intercepts on UFOs. I saluted some of them at the beginning of the book. Thomas Mantell and Felix Moncla were both killed doing intercepts of UFOs, and there's countless others that are unknown. And so we're going to be okay. and the future will look like Star Trek. I know it sounds, but remember, if you watch especially the original series of Star Trek, it wasn't all sweetness and light. I mean, sure, we were part of the Federation with the Vulcans and some other groups, and got along fine with them. But and the United and the not the United States, the humans were apparently a pretty important part of the Federation. We were a lot of the muscle for them. And so that's it. That universe was not all sweetness and light. There was the Romulans and the Klingons and people like that, the Gorn, that you didn't want to tangle with. But by and large, it was a very positive view of the future. And I believe that's what our future is going to look like. I do.
So we still have to get disclosure, and they've held on
We
to
still
it.
we have to have an honest conversation. I believe the government is moving toward disclosure. It's not moving as fast as I'd like, but at the same time, I try and mention stuff like this to my own family, close family, and they just look terrified by it. There are people out there who don't even want to hear about this stuff. It scares them. It scares them to death. The idea of aliens and hostile aliens in reality, not in a science fiction movie, scares them to death. And they're going to have to toughen up. A bunch of snowflakes. I'm sorry. Can't be snowflakes anymore. Got to wake up. Got to wake up. Fly right. Got to
All
be
right,
tough.
let's in the last 7 minutes or so, let's try to take some audience questions.
Yeah,
So I'm
I'm
just going to
sorry.
read it so people on the radio can hear this. All right. So what are your thoughts about how this UFO phenomena is a combination of physical beings, interdimensional, ultra-terrestrial, perhaps maybe some demonic, etc.?
Oh, well, I mean, uh, the Bible is full of, angels, which we would describe as interdimensional beings. And some of those angels are bad. And, ghosts, spirits, demons, things like that. They're in the Bible. And, I'm just an Episcopalian. I consider myself just a fairly plain brown wrapper Christian. And, okay. So it's a zoo out there. We're in a universe that has various levels of consciousness, a whole hierarchy. I mean, in the Bible, it says we're a little lower than the angels. That means we're lower than the angels, friends. That's a nice way of telling us we're something, but we shouldn't get a big head because they're people kind of above us in intelligence and abilities. And but the Bible also tells us just because we're a little lower than we're only a little lower than the angels. We're like the angels. And there's also one verse in the Bible that says we better watch out for these humans because there is nothing that they have imagined to do that they won't be able to do. That's what they evacuated God evacuated the tree of knowledge from the Garden of Eden so that we wouldn't have the keys to the whole thing, the whole library. But that's a very nice thing to say about us. I'm sure we're made of dust. You know where the word human comes from? Comes from the same root as humus, means dirt. We're made of the dust of the earth. That's not a really big deal. Okay. What are your thoughts on what is the ultimate source of all of this? Well, we're not alone in the universe, but a lot of people on Earth can't handle this. They can't. They have to be brought up to speed. And at family gatherings, people who know about this stuff, they're just going to have to talk to everybody. Look, there's a UFO cover up. It's real. And there's good stuff out there and there's bad stuff. The good stuff is trying to help us, and the bad stuff, we have to be tough. We have to be tough and face it. There.
Here's the next question.
All right. Smoking hot alien babes. Well, in Star Trek, the ones that were green, that had green dancing girls, occasionally beguiling the humans, and well, some of the reports are that here's a report I heard 2 weeks ago. Talk about.
Oh yeah, okay. I know what you're going to say. Okay.
Truth leaking out is they had some Pleiadian type aliens at Site 51.
By the way, that question was timed almost precognitively because I completely forgot to. I didn't know if you wanted to tell this story publicly, but go ahead.
They had these two Pleiadian women at Site 51 wearing tight spacesuits, you know, and they get restless at Site 51. It's out in the desert. They want to go to Vegas. So the military people in charge got them some clothes, you know, human female clothes, which they picked out, and they went and spent the weekend in Vegas. And that's just crazy enough a story that I believe it, because I know that any human being, somebody of the same psychology as us, if they're sitting out in the desert near Vegas and they can see the lights at night, they'd want to go there. So they went there, and they're psychics, so they probably won big at the, poker tables. I don't know. Anyway, it was just a very amusing story. And apparently the government escorted them there and escorted them back so they could. So it was better that because they wanted to make them happy. There.
All right. Here's the next one.
Oh yeah, the alien bases on the dark side of the moon. If you want to watch a really good movie, speaking of hot smoking women, watch The Mysterians, made in 1957. It's got aliens abducting Japanese girls into flying saucers and hybridization experiments. It's got bases on the far side of the moon. It's got underground bases on Earth from the aliens and big battles. It's made by the same folks who brought you Godzilla. So, of course, they have to have a giant robot running around knocking down buildings at one point. But that doesn't last very long. Basically, the aliens have a big base near Mount Fuji that's underground. And here's the fascinating thing. If you watch the movie, you can get it free on the internet. It's called The Mysterians, 1957. When the alien base comes up out of the ground, for about 1 second, it looks precisely like Devil's Mesa from Close Encounters of the Third Kind. And I thought, isn't that weird? There's psychic stuff going on that people don't, because the people who made the movie Close Encounters, made that mesa the center of the movie. And it actually appears in The Mysterians, made in 1957. And I know I know there was no the people who made Close Encounters were not aware of it. One thing, aliens in Close Encounters, that third kind are really bad. We stomped their ass with directed energy weapons, by the way.
All right, last question.
I think you can educate yourself.
Well, just for people on the radio.
You should.
What can we all do?
You should read my book. Think about it.
Well, let me ask the questions.
And then talk to other people in your families and friends and bring them up to speed.
And the question
what you can
was,
do.
what can we all do to help disclosure and raise the collective consciousness? So read the
Oh,
book,
just
talk to the
tell
family.
them, look, we're not alone. There are other people who, and we're not the first people to develop space travel. And not everybody out there is nice. Some of them are really nice. Some of them are really bad. And that's the three basic facts. And we can deal with all of them. We can deal with all of them.
Any final words, Dr. Brandenburg?
Keep the faith. We'll get through this. In God we trust. It's right on my dollar bill here. I'm sitting here looking at this dollar bill. It's got "In God we trust" on there. So,
all right. Thank you again, my friend. As always, an absolute pleasure.
always a pleasure. Always a pleasure and an honor to be on your show, Sean. And keep up the good work too. You're helping disclosure.
We'll see. I
By
only
the way,
have. I still.
I just say, I mean, there's government disclosure, and if that doesn't move fast enough, we've got exposure, where we all connect the dots for ourselves, and we take all of this, and there's a lot of CYA going on in the government about this. CYA means something really bad happens, like 9/11. And some agencies spend the next 2 weeks shredding all of the documents they had that gave them, that could have given an advance warning and stuff like that. And so part of disclosure, the reason disclosure is being held up, is the government has made some mistakes.
Oh, I don't think. I think if they wait any longer, the government's not going to last that much longer, because they've made so many mistakes in so many other fields of,
who's going to believe anything an Air Force official tells us at this point?
Yeah, nobody.
I mean,
Nobody.
what is the Air Force going to tell us? There are weather balloons all this time. The Air Force has zero credibility as far as I'm concerned. So that's one agency that may act. In my series of novels, the Air Force basically goes out of business because the UFO cover-up collapses, and they're left holding the bag. And so anyway, Sean, a pleasure and an honor. I better let you go.
Likewise. Okay. Talk soon, my friend.
Have a great evening.